Okay.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank you all for being here today, the interpretation team for their work, and the Centro Cultural de la Cooperación for welcoming us with the warm spirit they always manage to keep up. And we always find it a lovely place to meet. So we thank you deeply. Let me share with you an anecdote. At a point, we thought of conducting this panel at the Conti Cultural Center, where unfortunately it was not possible for political reason, because the Conti Cultural Center is closed these days, supposedly because there's an endless remodelation, as they call it, or repuffing of the building. But that's the situation. I just wanted to mention this. The aim of this panel that we organize within the research group, Surges of Authoritarianism, is not to deliver a master class to an audience of observers, but rather to contribute further elements to an ongoing set of discussions among us. That's why we mostly hope that what happens here will be a conversation, one that helps us think and act more clearly in this current conjuncture. The title of our project refers to this question that is an inextricable entanglement of theory and practice, or if you will, of interpretation and transformative action. By surges of authoritarianism, we mean, on the one hand, a problematic situation of the world that emerges and we must think about in its singularities and its interconnections, trying not to treat authoritarian phenomena as exotic anomalies, nor to reproduce the all too familiar gestures of theoretical imperialism that claim a supposed universality for their concept by disregarding the cases that do not fit in or that contradict them. But in our title, Surges of Authoritarianism also refers to what which urges collective action. If we are all interpreters of this situation, it is not because we observe what emerges from the safe distance of various theoretical trenches, but because we are already acting within it. And the question then is then to collectively consider how we are acting and how we could act better. To put it in typical Latin American Baroque fashion, with both Nietzsche and Horacio González, we do not debate our diagnosis of the present like the idle loafer strolling through the garden of knowledge, but as disoriented petitioners, searching for the terms to name a harm done and what could reverse it, situated in a state of urgency. Though it may sound contradictory at first, it is precisely because we are placed and urged that we want to protect the space to be able to think and interpret, even if it takes a bit longer. It is not time we're wasting, it's time we are creating. And we create it by breaking with the fascist time of immediacy, which allows only for giving up in the face of faits accompli or the blind reproduction of a disinhibition that does not liberate. Much to the dismay of the Trumps and the Millets, history is not over, and we are here to ask how it will continue, which means, among other things, asking what harms and what is harmed, and also whether it harms us all in the same way and why. Is it fascism that harms? Is it colonialism, capitalism, authoritarianism? Is it patriarchy? Is it neoliberalism? What's harm is our capacity to understand, our affectivity, our bodies on the surface of the earth. Is it our imagination of temporality that differs from the prevailing one? Is it the relation between those non-contemporary visions and our capacity to act? When did it all begin? When were we not besieged by various forms of violence? And who really is this we? I believe my fellow panelists will offer some starting points to think these questions through as prompts to continue our conversation later on. So thank you in advance all for your participation, and I will introduce the different panelists in the order in which they are going to present their presentations. Paula Biglieri, raise your hand, Paula, please. She's an independent researcher at CONICET and a professor at the National University of La Plata and UBA. In addition to several edited volumes, she's co-authored of Los usos del psicoanálisis en la teoría de hegemonía de Ernesto Laclau. And in 2022, she published Siete ensayos sobre populismo, also translated into English. Rosaura Martínez Ruiz is a full professor of philosophy at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and a member of the National System of Researchers. She's the author of Freud and Derrida, Escritura and Psique, Eros, Más allá de la punzal de muerte, which has also been translated into English, and Trauma o En busca de la agencia perdida, escucha y subversión, published in 2024. Daniel Loick is an associate professor of social and political philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, a visiting professor at the University of New York, and the principal investigator of Emergencies of Authoritarianism project. He has published 5 books, the most recent of which, A Theory of Counter-Communities, was published in German last year, and The Abuse of Propriedad has been translated into Spanish by Agustín Pres Filippo and published by Ubu Ediciones. And last but not least, Zeynep Gambetti served for 20 years as Associate Professor of Political Theory at Boğaziçi University in Turkey, and currently co-chairs the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs. Among her publications, Rhetorics of Insecurity, Belonging and Violence in the Neoliberal Era, is co-authored with Marcial Godoy and Nativia, and Vulnerability in Resistance, Politics, Feminism Theory, co-authored with Judith Butler and Leticia Sapsay. Very well, thank you very much, and give the floor to my co-panelists. Good evening. First and foremost, I wanted to thank the organizers, Gisela and her team, for the possibility of being here. And it's a pleasure for me to be here with friends sharing this space and colleagues that I'm getting acquainted with, but it's a pleasure to meet. So I'll try to be brief. The paper I'm going to present has the title Fascism, or When Stupidity Becomes a Social Problem, a brief reflection on Argentina. And I would like to mention a quote by Leon Trotsky that said, "Everyone has the natural right to be stupid, but beyond a certain point, it becomes an intolerable privilege." Here we are discussing in social sciences and different disciplines in general, once again, the word fascism, a word that we have left aside in the past decades or some years ago. And in the debate, it was not a hot issue in political terms, not even close, because we were at a time that we took for granted that the practices based on liberal democracy were not in question. However, today we see ourselves compelled to reflect on fascism. So there are different authors who have started to work on this field, chief among them, Traverso, a compilation from Le Monde Diplomatique with a series of interventions from Alain Badiou, Mauricio Lafarato, and Daniel Feierstein, Argentina, etc. So it's a theme that has started to re-emerge around fascism in the times we are experiencing can be categorized under the same term, fascism. On this regard, in 2021, Kadai, a colleague, regarding the word fascism, we try to clear out confusion that is typical from the global north when we differentiate populism from fascism. In general, in the global north, they tend to mistake populism with fascism, or to mingle them, because we consider that to name populism or right-wing populism to Trump or Orban's government is not only a conceptual mistake, but a strategic mistake in the political struggle. So, for example, we can put in the same lot Lula's or Bolsonaro's government, or Kirchner and Millei's. They are all populist, right-wing or left-wing populist, but with a negative connotation. So we contend that those that have been mistakenly called right-wing populism is actually a renewed expression of fascism, neoliberal fascism, because at the heart of political projects like Trump's Make America Great Again lies the fantasy of achieving the community's lost unity. And we said in that book that that lost unity had originated due to the intrusion of an external presence that threatens it from within. The other, whether immigrant, peasant, indigenous, black, woman, gay, lesbian, or trans, is an element disrupting unity that prevents community to become transparent to itself. Thus, fascism always plays with the fantasy of achieving one people, a people with no antagonisms or differences, where the elimination of the threatening figure would restore that lost unity. This fantasy makes the other a sacrificial object that would enable the community's restoration, sacrificing the other to become that longed-for restoration of disrupted order. But apart from this sacrifice of the other, the novelty of the neoliberal context that adds something to this contemporary fascism is a displacement of guilt. Because not only we put the blame on the other for the loss of plenitude or fulfillment of the community, but we also blame ourselves. We ourselves become to blame. So the fantasy becomes that in order to restore the lost order, we propose the elimination of the other, plus it's also branded by that idea that we ourselves are the only ones to blame for the evils that besiege us. It is, from a psychoanalytical perspective, is a fertile ground for what Freud called the cultural superego, a cruel judge of the ego that puts moral at the center. Jacques Lacan reinforced this idea by revisiting what Freud called moral masochism, the way of enjoying, of ego's way of enjoying being the object of the superego's cruelty. This Lacanian equation between the Freudian superego and jouissance, the satisfaction that is not due to pleasure, which Jorge Aleman notes aligns with neoliberalism, helps us understand how the superego's moral imperative floods the subject with impossible demands, loading it with guilt, being unable to satisfy them, and remaining in debt, leading to more sacrifice, sacrifice upon sacrifice, where the subject will never rise to the demands, and all this circuit will get renewed. Guilt, debt, sacrifice is not enough. We are not up to the standards. We are not entrepreneurial enough. That's why money is not enough. We do not sacrifice enough, etc. It's an endless loop. So we have that failed subject who's a failure because it's never good enough, who becomes sacrificial to themselves and to others onto whom they project their hatred and frustration. Hatred due to frustration. Now, recently in 2024, Judith Butler has entered this debate on fascism. I've been following her presentation. If you Google on YouTube, Butler, Fascist Passion, you will find the conference I'm going to mention now. This is what she presented at a conference in 2024. There, Butler develops the notion of fascist passion to think of this authoritarian times. And her interesting interventions, I would like to focus on a specific aspect by which she points out that many of the fascists of today do not conceive themselves as being harmful. Quite the contrary, in fact. They believe they are doing good because their task is to keep at bay the evil forces. According to Butler, this task of eliminated evil, they practice offensive practices, stripping of rights and the abandoning of people to dire fates. And these practices are especially executed in marginalized, humiliated communities. Butler mentions that there is a transvaluation at play by which harmful acts are renamed as good, and grievance in these conditions is not grievance at all, but something good. The good society requires for the restoration of that longed for order or good life that was once lost. But this transvaluation has not only been normalized, but it generates the enthusiasm of exerting harm in the name of good. That enthusiasm, as long as they get rid of the moral restrictions, the traditional moral restrictions, and authorizes destructive action and with full conviction. This is the shameless sadism of fascist passions. I found it really interesting. Butler's argument was very interesting to me. And let me point to what she presents. Her presentation is much longer. She shows this harmful political act that causes damage is experienced by many as something good, morally right, or morally necessary, in such a way that they feel enabled to act destructively with the full conviction that what they are doing is right, since they are aiming at restoring the good life, or the good order in the world. as if a fascist did not know or did not realize that they are actually fascist and that they would passionately set out to destroy the lives of others, the supposed embodiment of evil. And to a certain extent, they are convinced that they are good people who act in the name of good.
This aspect of fascism in earlier times of historical fascism, some time ago, in the times of all the fascisms we know historically, was approached as a problem of stupidity. And I would like to bring up a theologist and a pastor, a Protestant pastor from Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly. They can correct me, but he was an active member of the resistance against Hitler, and he was executed after being jailed for 2 years in April 1945. And on a text that was written while imprisoned by the Nazi regime, he reflected on stupidity or folly. And he did it through an equivalent, folly. The German word he used was, and here I go again, Dummheit. Is that okay? Which is stupidity mostly. In Spanish, if you look in the dictionary, necedad is one of the synonyms to stupidity, which is sort of like folly, but I don't think it's quite right terminologically. But what's most interesting about this Protestant pastor is the fact that he argued that stupidity should not be seen as an individual issue. Yes, it's not about saying I'm on a high horse and I think others are stupid, yes, or another person is stupid. He argued that stupidity was not an individual issue. It didn't have to do with an intellectual defect that comes naturally with a person, nor was it a lack of education. Because, and I quote, we discover with surprise in certain situations that there are people who are intellectually agile from an intellectual point of view, who are at the same time stupid, and others who are intellectually very clumsy but are not foolish. So we realize that stupidity is not an innate defect, but that under certain circumstances, people become stupid or allow themselves to be made so. So collective stupidity is considered a social problem prompted by certain historical contexts. This is what von Heffer used to say. It's not so much a psychological problem, but rather a sociological one, generated in specific situations, and I quote once again, where the power of some needs the folly of others. The author continues by saying that it arises when human beings are deprived of their inner independence by the overwhelming impression of power's display. Therefore, stupidity is dangerous not because of a lack of intelligence or education, but because of the lack of autonomous thinking or critical thinking that allows one, and once again I quote, to find a personal stance in life situations. And also because of the submission induced by power, or that is created by the influence of power through propaganda or intimidation. Bonhoeffer also claims that stupidity acts more or less unconsciously, to the point that when we confront a stupid person, and I quote once again, we realize we are not dealing with this stupidity in a person, but with slogans and catchphrases that have taken hold of them. Turned into an instrument devoid of its own will, the stupid person can do any evil and at the same time be incapable of recognizing it as evil. So at this point, I believe there is a convergence between what Butler argues and what Bonhoeffer argues as well. What Butler describes as fascist passions, Bonhoeffer called stupidity. We might say even that it's fascism through stupidity. Today's fascism and its actors are enacted by both leaders and followers who do not consider the grave consequences that they generate. And in stupidity, there is no ethic of responsibility and only the foolish action of dogmatic arrogance and the violence of prejudice. But for Bonhoeffer, the gravest problem is that faced with stupidity, we are defenseless. We cannot reason with a fool because there is no way to approach the stupid person because they do not relent in the face of reason or empirical proof. And since we are not in the front of a skeptic, the stupid will grab onto their prejudices that they can defend violently. And I quote Bonhoeffer once again. In the face of stupidity, we have no defense. We are unable to do anything against it, even if we do protest or if we use strength. The reasons have no effect. The stupid person stops believing in facts that contradict their prejudice. In such cases, he even becomes critical. And if the facts are unavoidable, he simply dismisses them as isolated and unimportant cases. And thus, unlike the bad man, the fool feels self-satisfied and can even become dangerous when, slightly irritated, he goes on the attack. And with these theoretical tools in hand, I will focus on the current scenario. We may say that in Argentina's far-right authoritarian government led by Milei, are we living through an era of fascist stupidity? I think that all the signs are pointing towards a yes. We have a government and a significant sector of the Argentine public that sees itself as morally superior. They are decent people or part of the heavenly forces. They believe that they are doing good actions, and feel no responsibility whatsoever for the harm their actions cause. They believe their moral superiority lies in accepting personal sacrifice. So it's worth making the sacrifice, right? Cutting wages, reducing pensions, layoffs, tax hikes, etc. They consider these facts necessary and morally good in order to restore that longed-for order. They are convinced that the task ahead is to fight against those they deem morally inferior, meaning those who embody evil and who refuse sacrifice. We can mention the Peronist movement, the left, the progressives, the feminists, indigenous people, migrants, etc. Yes? And the far right seeks to restore the good order that once existed, and they see that as something that has been lost because of populism. And in order to do so, they do a policy of domestication and sacrifice of those embodying evil by stripping rights and engaging in abandonment, censorship, intimidation, and repression of social protest. And so I wonder, are we defenseless in the face of overwhelming fascist stupidity? I was just reading that Bonhoeffer is not an optimistic in this case. However, he believes that there is one resource left. In the face of submission and loss of critical thinking and autonomous thinking, we only have resistance left. The only option is resistance. But this resistance, remember that he was a Protestant pastor, this resistance, in his view, must proceed from a Christian ethic, one that is closer to an independent, autonomous, and thus critical stance. And what's most interesting of what he says is the following: in which he cannot follow a blind adherence to rules or institutions, not even an irrestrict following of the church. Yes, so this pastor said that they could even go against the church, which is a very interesting position. So they must have a radical commitment to God. And this means a commitment and a respect for the world as it is, since God manifests in many forms everywhere in the world, and should not come from an approach that tries to mold the world according to dogmas and prejudices. Butler, for her part, proposes a confrontation of fascist passions with with our own passions, but the ones that must emerge and that must be supported by a new imaginary, so powerful that it becomes irresistible and that can defeat the passions that fuel the right. And like Bonhoeffer, she returns to critical thinking, because for being the opposition, this imaginary must be framed by critical analysis and driven by a desire to change the world. It is essential, then, to oppose fascist passions that promote dispossession of rights in a framework where some lives are disposable and are not worth mourning, and which targets vulnerable communities. An anti-fascist opposition framework must be grounded in a radically egalitarian imaginary with cohabitation, open and demilitarized borders, and of a democracy that rejects discrimination and segregation based on gender, race, religion, or ethnicity. Radical equality is what Butler claims, that must go beyond the nation and nationality and be based on interdependence between humans, other creatures, and the processes that sustain life on Earth. And as you can see, Bonhoeffer and Butler, who may seem opposed, but are yet so united in their anti-fascist stance, both call for resistance. But as we saw, it's a resistance that involves more than just critical thinking. For Bonhoeffer, it entails a radical commitment to God. And for Butler, it must include desire. So it's not just about critical or rational thinking, but where there must be desire. And so the question is, what about the case of Argentina? I believe that we've made the case that in order to find this resistance, we require more than critical thinking, because it seems insufficient, because critical thinking seems unable to penetrate fascist stupidity, because fascists are unmoved by arguments or by facts. We've already tried that before, and it seems to not go anywhere. Dialogue, conversation, it doesn't really go very far. And also, in public discourse in Argentina, we find mechanisms aimed at silencing critical voices. How can there be critical thinking if there's silencing actions taking place? We have the logic of trolls on social media, trolls financed by the official, the ruling party, and information spaces that are dominated, in most cases, by journalists who, instead of playing their role, they act as government pundits instead of performing their function. And public university schools of humanities and social sciences, which historically have been producers of critical thinking, that are being gutted and, of course, deprived of their budgets. There are also attacks against artists who speak out against the government. And within the public spaces for discussion, what takes place at the National Congress is a clear representation of this, supposedly the embodiment of democracy, but where the representatives, instead of making decisions through critical discussions and critical thinking, and instead of doing this, we find that congressmen, both deputies and senators, are following the orders of their provincial governors, and they exchange, yes, transactions, they exchange privileges. You make a highway and you give me your vote for a law, or are swayed by anti-populist bias where hatred prevails over reason. We've also tried massive protests against fascism, and there have been many public demonstrations. And there have been very many demonstrations by armed groups that are laid off, for example. But in addition to the massive nature of these protests, we've had 3 general strikes convened by the CGT, 2 general strikes, and a massive university march defending public universities. But in addition to these protests, these have been attempts of protests that are part like a specific demand, the demand of workers, the demands of university students or those who defend public education. But there has been a failure to expand this more massively. Regardless of this limitation, there is an attempt to extend this to other demands and other struggles. But every Wednesday, we see how they repress the retired population who marches against the government. We still insist. One of the most striking protests that took place, and the idea of something that could be different, was a march that took place on February 1st this year, which was the march, the federal LGBTQ plus anti-fascist and anti-racist march. I think that a new element provided by this march or this protest was the fact that the political sense of the government was under dispute, that political sense that Milei wants to instill. And up until now, this element had been absent. There were some massive protests, but like I said before, they were very specific protests of a certain particular subject. And so this relaunched a logic of equivalence that had been absent before. And through a series of oppressed populations were identified one with the other, and protests are mobilized through the call of a particular subject. And the label fascist, in this case, brought together a massive crowd, and a crowd that made it clear that it recognized Milei's authoritarian practices under that name. So I think that the power of this protest was twofold. First, it was able to unite a variety of different demands. And at the same time, it was able to name Milei's government as fascist. And fascism, that constitutive other, is what could become, maybe, a broad political subjectivity anchored in its opposite, which is anti-fascism. So I believe that we should try once more. Let's resist with love, with identification among the oppressed, in order to build a new solidarity-based tie. Because the signs that we can pick up from this anti-fascist march indicate that there is a potential reactivation of the populist logic. Maybe or maybe not, but there's a renewed equivalential chain between heterogeneous demands and antagonistic frontier that could give rise to a dichotomy, fascist, anti-fascist, and that could give rise to new political subjectivity called the people. I think that the rupture of the hegemony provoked by Milei and by this structure that dominated in the past years, which was this opposition between Kirchnerism and anti-Kirchnerism, and the common legacy on what democracy means, I believe this demands work from us in terms of making sure that the figure of the people emerges once again, but not a mere repetition of past experiences. To antagonize against Milei's authoritarianism, we must respond with novelty. And for that, we need imagination and generosity. We must rebuild the popular field, and with that, a new political subjectivity called people. And this does not mean discarding everything, throwing everything that has been achieved. It means linking present with past to project it onto the future. However, not all elements of a new people must be new. There is no blank slate here, but there must be new nodes of articulation. It's about composing a new people that can house our legacies, our emblems, victories and defeats, the names we defended and still know how to defend, while also remaining open so that something new can emerge to open a future horizon. Meanwhile, the LGBTQ plus movement, well-versed in pride, has something to say. All those subjectivities historically part of the popular field and which now in a very brief frame want to be presented by fascism as a sign of the Peronism or Kirchnerism, etc., have to be part of the public arena once again as proud political banners and in representation of a broad collective front to reclaim that notion of freedom so that it is once again tied to the community's destiny. Justice becomes a limit on sacrificial mandates. They must be the limit to the sacrificial mandate, and we must repurpose solidarity so that there's space for everyone, and so that we can claim once again equality to guarantee democracy. Thank you.
Gracias, Paula.
Thank you, Paula. Rosaura, the floor is yours. First and foremost, I would like to thank Gisela for having organized this panel and having invited us to chat and converse with fellow colleagues who are on the same side of the battlefield. I wrote a reflection on the situation Mexico is experiencing around the question of drug trafficking and the illegal trade of certain drugs. I'm sure you are aware of what Mexico is experiencing in terms of drug cartels, but also the forced disappearance of people that is hitting hard. I would like to combine this Mexican reality with authoritarianism, global authoritarianism. Since you know we are living in a second term with a leftist government, this time even led by a woman president, Claudia Sheinbaum. So I would like to ask ourselves, it seems that even with a left-wing government, we are still not free from the effects, nefarious effects of neoliberalism. I entitled my work as waste subjectivity as a product of neoliberalism as an economic and ideological system. Currently, as you know, Mexico is beginning a second term with a leftist government, and this time led by a woman, Claudia Sheinbaum. The previous six-year term implemented many social and economic policies that ran counter to the neoliberal trend of inequality, policies that this new government continues committed to improve these policies. However, this is not beyond these destructive tendencies of global authoritarianism. Today, I want to talk about violence and the international decision to make certain drugs illegal connected to free market and the domination of the value of exchange that has been dominating Mexico due to historical reasons for poverty, colonization, and geopolitical location. Also, how political, economic reasons, there are certain people that I consider disposable and subjectivities that can be identified as waste, that can be identified and they identify themselves as waste. What I want to propose is a combination between the articulation between the culture of exchange value and the consumption of objects with luxury items, with the expulsion of large part of the world's population and the participation of young people and children into drug cartels. Neoliberalism has as its core the destruction and sacrifice of most of the world's population. The expulsion from this economic and ideological system is not only in terms of consumption capacity, because the subjective and political recognition is linked to the possession of objects with high exchange value, which means that expulsion is also experienced on a psychic level. That is not only an economic system, but this economic system has an ideology whereby social recognition and political acknowledgement depends on the capacity for consumption. So this becomes an imperative, a psychic imperative. I have, therefore I exist, or I don't have, therefore I'm nobody. The association between consumption capacity and social status is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to certain groups, but a value that is shared across all social strata. The relationship between the possession of high exchange value products, social recognition, and happiness is fundamental to this neoliberal model. This system, while generating exchange value, produces waste, objects with use value that leave the market because they are not profitably exchangeable. The same happens with many individuals who are eager for the prevailing social recognition, and their possession of objects are abysmal to their situation. Illicit business that generate large profits reflect a natural echo of the neoliberal economy and ideology. Drug trafficking is not an anomaly of this value system. It is logical that for wealth to be concentrated among 1% of the population, there is another large portion of the population that is impoverished and cannot attain their survival or decent jobs or acquire what they consider necessary to be recognized and valued in society. Thus, many are forced to start their own businesses illegally. These illicit ventures operate under the same logic: to quickly make a lot of money from individual initiatives. Young people that are ambitious and motivated turn to the drug economy, a booming sector worth billions of dollars, because they believe in the image of the successful man that is millionaire. They believe that illicit business is not a neoliberalism accident. It's their own Frankenstein. The extreme violence are directly proportional to the violence of expulsion and social waste produced by neoliberalism. We must not lose sight of the fact that subjectivity is a dialectical or speculative formation. That is, otherness is inherent and essential to the process of formation of singularity. I mean that identity is fundamentally crude from what one is not, that is, in contrast to and in the struggle for the recognition of the other. At this stage of capitalism, I want to propose the category of waste subjectivity or discarded subjectivity as those who have been expelled, as the surplus, as the expendable, yet unwelcome and undesirable. These subjects have a history of precarious and spiritual conditions. They have been excluded from the productive sectors, and their lives have been condemned to malnutrition, physical, intellectual, and spiritual degradation, despite being surrounded by unprecedented wealth in Mexico. This population fails to establish a productive connection with any legitimate sector of the globalized economy and get trapped in marginalized areas of the city where they survive thanks to the only economic activity that still offers them employment, the illegal drug trade. And I would like to point out this business is one of the paths the waste subject takes. I'm not saying that the criminal action is an unavoidable destination. There are paths, voluntary servitude, resistance also, but this path is one of that I would call waste subjectivity. Waste subjectivity is an intersection, not from not being black, white, heterosexual man, but if under no circumstance or effort to achieve becoming a white, successful man. The only path, the only way to experience an even minimal dose of that recognition is by violently seizing what you do not have and that you will obtain illegally. I will analyze this temporal aspect of this seizure, but this question of seizure or assaulting social recognition is a struggle that we know that is until they die, because they know that they get to this risk. So illegality of drug trade means that drug can be sold at extremely high prices. Thus, the competition for control of sales territories between different cartels is to the death. These waste subjects have internalized that their lives are worth nothing unless they obtain the means to buy the objects and services exchanged for social status. And they pursue this knowing that their lives can be cut short. The desire of the discarded object is to stop being on the margins and to perceive themselves and be perceived as part of this sphere. Unlike the proletariat, their demand is not political. It's not revolutionary. Their interest is not the transformation of the world. Their aspiration is not emancipation, but rather to take the place of the oppressor, the bourgeois, or the legitimate upper class subject in this case. In Marxist terms, their goal is not the socialization of the means of production, nor is it to be the state. Their only interest is to gain the kind of recognition enjoyed by the oppressor, in the case of neoliberalism, and have access to luxury objects and services. I insist, their aspirations are not outside of shared culture. They are not values exclusive to this mode of subjectivization. This is brought about by the values generated in the neoliberal economic model. In countries like Mexico, where more than half of the population lives in poverty, lies in the fact that millions of people cannot and will never be able to legally satisfy all the needs and desires fostered by the economic system they live in. Thus, the appropriation of illegal means for the production of capital is considered the only way to occupy a place in society and avoid being relegated to the sidelines. The discarded subject shares with the bourgeois the false idea that poverty is a personal and fortuitous situation attributed to the responsibility of the individual who experiences it. Aside from material deprivation, this creates a sense of inferiority compared to others, leading people to feel isolated, despised, and hopeless. Their material conditions even limit their possibility to escape suffering. It's not surprising then that from this perspective, those who suffer these levels of spiritual misery seek to acquire by any means signs of worth that allow them to prove they are not poor and seek acceptance in a society that has expelled them as waste. Of course, the conflict is socio-political, but their actions are not. There is no demand, there is an assault. Like most Mexicans, drug traffickers and offenders fight to get the share of the pie as quickly as possible. In their quest for success, they mimic the classic neoliberal model of socioeconomic advancement, forging aggressive careers as entrepreneurs that drive them to take risks, work hard, and rely on Santa Muerte, Saint Death, of Catholic faiths for good fortune. These young people embody the essence of bold individualism, bravely facing an unpredictable frontier where fortune, fame, and destruction can be just around the corner, in an uncertain environment where the enemy is ruthlessly hunted down and eliminated. What happens when you are not recognized as an indispensable part of society and when you're treated as waste? When the way of recognition is the lack of it, when recognition is in the form of waste. Economic demands are today more than ever inextricably linked to the human need for dignity and respect. Physical sustenance is as important as social recognition. At the core of this lies the time between satisfaction from the desire of recognition. For the discarded subject, the need for social admiration is perceived as imperative. Possibly, this sense of urgency can be explained by the elements physical, emotional, and psychological appetites that historically have not been fulfilled. The public space is saturated by images that portray comforts and luxury items as the sole and universal source of happiness and satisfaction. Never mind if they are advertising food, beverages, supplements, clothing, accessories, cars, or services. The leading actors are all white or whitened, rich, and either content or fulfilled. The satisfaction of any or the fulfillment of any need has been associated to luxurious material possessions. Objects are thus fetishized. Everything can be solved by the consumption of luxury items. Population has even got distracted from hunger, education, cultivation of the arts, and recreation. Nevertheless, hunger and all the other needs remain pressing. The waste subject has grown up in extreme deprivation and confuses luxury items with objects that alleviate other desires. However, since the other needs are directly life or death, they are all experienced as urgent. Thus, the waste subject risks their own life and kills in order to immediately quench a long history of all kinds of deprivation and violence. These individuals are said to seek the easy way out. I don't understand the adjective. I don't think that risking the life every minute is easy, but easy refers to the short time, since the effort is not directed toward performing legitimate work that is socially recognized as productive, even if it's exploitative. In psychoanalytic terms, that this can be understood as the death-driven satisfaction of desires, as it tends towards material death or the mutilation of physical arousal, which is clearly perceived when subject is under the influence of drugs. This path is immediate and it's self-destructive. Karina Garcia states, from their perspective, getting involved in drug trafficking and other crimes represented an attractive option because they believed they had nothing to lose. Their testimony is compelling. For those whom existence is disposable, death is considered a liberation from suffering. To understand the psychic economy of waste subjectivity, it's necessary to understand what a history of deprivation and physical and emotional violence triggers. The repeated frustration of basic needs and desires for the reproduction of life, including social one, shortens life expectancy, obliterating the image of a better future. Only immediate present remains. This subject determines that he has nothing, and thus there's nothing to lose. his life is already lost, and thus they may risk it for the sake of a present or a fleeting moment of satisfaction. It is precisely there, in the space between desires and reality, that drug business, illicit drug trade, appears as a good alternative. A need or desire that cannot include future satisfaction cannot wait. According to Freud, it is the memory of previous experiences of satisfaction that can mediate a delay in the difference of fulfillment of a desire. By this, I mean that if the repertoire is short of these experiences, or if it's played with deprivation, we can assume that the subject lacks the necessary resources to delay reward, and so they will seek immediate satisfaction or accelerated satisfaction. The important thing is that no obstacle can be tolerated, precisely because the memory repertoire has recorded that obstacles are permanent. Therefore, they cannot be bypassed but destroyed. It has to do with the memory of a reality that, on the one hand, has repeatedly failed to provide the material conditions for a dignified reproduction of the lives of these individuals, bombarded with images and narratives where social recognition can only be achieved through the possession of certain objects. In short, waste subjectivity has a death-driven sexuality. Satisfaction of desire is perceived as urgent and therefore must be resolved immediately, even if it costs one's own life or another person's life. In one way, you're already dead. All vital needs get regenerated, reborn, repeated: hunger or thirst, sexual desire, but also social recognition. The desire for recognition, like any other, seeks to be repeatedly satisfied. A repeated denial develops a feeling of animosity toward the world. The frustration of thwarted desires and unmet needs, coupled with the persistent realization that others are fulfilling them, are factors that create a breeding ground for organized crime to recruit children and young people into its ranks. These organizations, unlike the state and their families, comply by providing them with the money and physical protection they lack. The feeling of inferiority and the perception of being despised by society grows into a poisonous and fatal resentment, and the cartel becomes family. The rage and desire for destruction has to be recognized as the effect of the extreme inequality generated by neoliberal economy and ideology, and not with specific and rare characteristics. By this, I mean that the level of violence generated by illegal trade is not exotic, but intrinsic to the concentration of wealth and social inequality, the cuts to social programs, to public health services, to free quality public education, to the austerity of the state that shrinks it more and more, to the consumer culture, hedonism, and class and sexist domination. It's a social political failure, not an anomaly of the system. And the system will not address the underlying problem. First, because there are at least two other legitimate businesses that directly benefit from it: arms sales and the stock market that speculates and earns billions from the vast sums of money earned by drug lords. Second, because addicts and criminals working illegally on the streets assimilate anger and despair, venting their violence primarily against themselves and the community around them, rather than directing it against those who structurally oppress them. Finally, those who suffer the violence the most are themselves, because we have built apartheids. The upper classes live with fear, but rarely the extreme violence of the working classes. They have the resources to raise fences, electrified fences, and live in gated communities where, incidentally, drug lords also live in. Their neighbors. They hire private security, armored cars, change walks in public parks for shopping centers, etc. Neoliberalism Liberalism is an epiphenomenon that fundamentally produces waste subjects and disposable humans. In Mexico, violence has even disrupted justice after death. The crisis of forced disappearances has meant that not every missing person is worthy of immediate search. Bodies of the disappeared are buried, dissolved in acid, or turned to ashes throughout our territory, desecrating their humanity and our soil, which should be a place where every person is worthy of burial, a place where their families and friends can honor them, bring them flowers, pray for them, mourn them. There are Mexicans whose absence has neither been acknowledged nor addressed as a human lost, first and second class citizens, if the notion of citizenship even applies here. For marginalized groups in society to claim and obtain the respect they deserve, it is essential that government policies address the complex cultural and social dynamics that go beyond material and practical needs. It is crucial to challenge and modify the prevailing neoliberal mindset, which tends to blame victims for their failures and fails to imagine solutions to structural problems from a perspective other than individualism or pathologizing medical or psychological care that lacks a social epidemiological perspective. It is necessary to move beyond futile debate between well-meaning politicians who aim to address what has already been damaged instead of addressing and confronting the forcing that are devastating communities. And on the other, conservative people who seek to dismantle social assistance programs, cut taxes for large corporations and the wealthy, imprison the poor, and more broadly, marginalize poverty by criminalizing it.
Gracias,
Thank you, Rosaura. Daniel, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I want to also thank the Center Floreal Gorini. I think it's really important to keep up these spaces where we can have these kinds of discussions. It's not normal that centers are doing this, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion here. I also want to start by thanking the translators. I think it is a very important task, especially now that we are faced with global authoritarianism, fascism in many different countries, to engage in practices of translation. This is what makes it possible for me to be part of this conversation, for which I'm really grateful, but it is also a question, I think, of political solidarity and of political ethics to translate not only different languages, but also different concepts, different normative registers and vocabulary into each other and try to come together and understand each other. So I'm really, I think this is a kind of work that is often unnoticed, the work of translation. So I'm very happy that this is happening here. I haven't prepared a real paper. I just will talk a little bit about the question of authoritarian times. So the question of what is a temporality, what is the temporality of authoritarianism based on my own experiences and some thoughts, basically. I'm a typical academic, and my life is marked by the rhythm of commuting. I work in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, but I live in Frankfurt in Germany. And right now I'm in the US, in New York, for a visiting scholar position. So I have relationships to these three different places. And it feels to me often that the three places that I relate to are on a timeline, basically, that I have like starting fascism in Germany, where we have one neo-fascist party that is gaining more and more percentage, but it's not yet in the government. Then the Netherlands has like soft authoritarianism with a right-wing party in government, but not alone, so they have a coalition. And then you have full-blown fascism in the US. And these different stages basically then enable me to use a time machine. So I can go back and forth. I can be in the US and feel like, oh, this is the future where everybody else will end up. And then I can go back to Germany and say, be aware of what will happen to you in the future if we don't turn around. And this is kind of the feeling of Cassandra, of this mythical figure of Cassandra, who has seen the future and warns everybody, this will happen to you as well. So this is oftentimes this feeling that basically there's only one timeline and everybody will end up like the US eventually. This is a feeling that was recently challenged when I had dinner with two friends from Iran who live in Amsterdam, two Iranian dissidents who are now in Amsterdam, and we had a nice dinner and a discussion over wine. And when I had my second glass, I went into this rambling where I said, oh, everything will become worse and worse, and you have basically the neo-fascists now winning everywhere. You have Wilders in the Netherlands, you have Weidel in Germany, you have Le Pen in France, you have Trump in the US, you have Milei in Argentina, and everywhere it seems like basically the future will be fascist, and I was very afraid of that. And then my friends from Iran interrupted me and asked me, but Daniel, where in your story is the Iran? So you tell us a story that does not see what is happening in the world that we are from. And that was a very embarrassing moment for me, because I was reminded, or that's what they said to me, is the things that you expect to happen in the future have already happened in our past. This is something that is not in the future for us. It is something that has already happened and is continuing to happen. It is not so much a risk of the future. It is more something that is going on. So I then understood in this conversation with my friends that I made many mistakes in my original conception. One is, of course, that this is a quite Eurocentric understanding of what counts as fascism. Yeah? So in my original idea, I thought that we can recognize as fascist only those regimes that resemble in one way or the other the European example of Germany and Italy. And I failed to even identify other regimes in the world as being part of the same problematic. It was just not on my radar. And I also assumed, that was the second mistake, that basically all countries or all local contexts are on the same timeline, on the same trajectory. Everybody will end up like the US. So it is, in a way, a form of negative teleology that I assumed. Yeah, everything is getting worse. Not a progressive teleology, everything will get better, but more like a more pessimistic one. But still, I assumed that there is only one timeline, and there are just like different stages of that. And my friends reminded me that this is, of course, also wrong assumptions. And what I found also interesting in the reaction of my two friends was that they seemed to have a different emotional reaction to that. I was completely paralyzed. I felt like I was panicky and felt like, oh my God, this is going to happen. Oh my God, we have to do something. But this didn't really help me to be active. It didn't really help me to be in any way, to develop a form of resilience or so, but it really only paralyzed me. Whereas my friends seemed much less paralyzed, even though they were objectively maybe in a worse position because they had to actually leave their country because of the Iranian authoritarianism, but they seemed less paralyzed by it. They simply said, we just keep doing what needs to be done. This is just the activism or being a dissident was just part of their personal identity in their regular life. But they seemed less sad about it in a way than I was. So I was thinking then about how do we have to think about the temporality of authoritarianism or of authoritarian times differently. And one concept that I encountered in a different context, namely in the discussion about ecology and ecological questions, when we talk about the figure of the apocalypse, or this idea of the post-apocalyptic imaginary. I think the discourses around fascism and the discourses around ecological collapse are in many ways quite similar, because oftentimes both of these discourses warn us that something will bad happen in the future. So if we don't change, it will have catastrophic consequences, and ultimately it will lead to an apocalypse, even the extinction of the human race. And again, this image that the ecological collapse will happen in the future overlooks something very important, namely that we can say that the apocalypse is already here, that in many parts of the world, the question of ecological collapse is not a question of a future risk, but it is a concrete reality in many parts of the world that are already inhabitable, that are already toxic wastelands. Many cities are already destroyed by ecological disasters, many lives, many peoples, and many species are already irrevocably lost. And I think this is very clear if you look at the current pictures of Gaza, where it is quite difficult, I would say, to say the apocalypse is something that will happen in the future. It is something that has already happened. Some scholars in the ecological debate or in the debate about this question of apocalypse suggest, therefore, to move from an apocalyptic imaginary to a post-apocalyptic imaginary, to really acknowledge that we already live in apocalyptic times. And one of these thinkers is a Marxist cultural theorist named Evan Calder Williams. And he says the world is already apocalyptic, just not all at the same time. And Williams proposes a concept that was introduced by Trotsky. It's the second time that Trotsky is mentioned today, surprisingly. Trotsky uses the term of the uneven and combined development, uneven and combined development. This is, Williams argues that we also are witnessing an uneven and combined apocalypse. Apocalypse is uneven because different local contexts follow their own trajectory in their own pace. Yeah, so, for example, some parts of the global north, Gisela doesn't like the term global north and global south, but we can discuss that later. So for some parts of the global north, I think the apocalypse is a threat in the future, but for some other parts of the world, it has already happened or is happening right now. But it's not just uneven, it is also combined. It influences each other because the apocalypse of some is the effect of the normality of others. So some have the luxury of awaiting the apocalypse in the future because it has already happened for others. And this is because the global economies are now interconnected in such a way that the normal order of business for some outsources its destructive consequences into other places of the world. And acknowledging this different timelines and this interconnectedness leads also to a different politics and a different effective response to the apocalypse. It's not just warning what will happen and then fearing it might lead to a form of paralysis, but This is something that Evan Calder-Williams really emphasizes. He really emphasizes the importance of mourning, of what has already been lost and will never be recovered, and to reckon with it, what has already been lost. And Williams here refers to the science fiction genre of the salvage punk. Salvaging is a word that I had to look up myself. I didn't know the English word. It means basically a figure, or punk figure, that is searching the ruins for something that can be used in order to build a future out of the rubble and the debris of the ruins of the lost world. And the typical salvage punk is Mad Max, who after the apocalypse uses something from the dead world or builds it all together in his cars and so on. So this could be a figure of redemption, not so much fighting the apocalypse, but trying to salvage something that we can still use. The Walking Dead is another example, or now The Last of Us, which is now popular again. Yeah, post-apocalyptic films that are set in a world where everything is already lost. So I think this idea we could also mobilize for fascism, right? Because fascism is also uneven and combined. It is uneven certainly on a global scale, and this is something that many anti-colonial thinkers have argued, that the situation that we describe as fascism was oftentimes a situation that was very close very close to the reality of many colonized people. The Marxist historian Cedric Robinson expresses this quite clearly, and I quote him here: "From the perspective of many non-Western people, the occurrence of fascism, that is militarism, imperialism, racialized authoritarianism, choreographed mob violence, millenarian crypto-Christian mysticism, nostalgic nationalism, was no more an historical aberration than colonialism, the slave trade, and slavery." So that means fascism, from the perspective of many non-Western peoples, he says, is not something that can follow to democracy, but it can exist alongside democracy, or can even be caused by it. And this unevenness can also be described from within a state, within a capitalist society. This is a central point of many other thinkers of the Black radical tradition, like Angela Davis or George Jackson, who often spoke of the fact that the reality of Black people in the US was similar to fascism. For example, Bobby Seale, who was the founder of the American Black Panther Party, expresses this already in a speech in 1970, when he says, "Another thing worries me, fascism. We often hear the Black Panther Party speak of fascism, and whites have difficulty accepting the word. That's because whites have to make a great effort of imagination to understand that blacks live already under an oppressive fascist regime." So even within formerly liberal democratic societies, these thinkers have pointed out that for many people, the experience of harassment, of a nighttime arrest, even of murder, is not a fear that has to do with one political system turning into another political system, but that it is already part of their everyday lived reality. So fascism, like the apocalypse, is uneven. It can exist for some, but not for others. But it is also combined. It also influences each other. This is something that Frantz Fanon already insisted on, that the mute compulsion that is governing life in the metropoles, so the relatively soft form of coercion that marks the reality of everyday capitalist life in the metropoles, that this mute compulsion was only possible because there was also the brutal violence that was governing the life in the colonies. But combined also, that doesn't not only consist in the colonizers imposing proto-fascist regimes on the colonies, it also works the other way around. The colonies also influence the metropoles. And this is what another anti-colonial thinker, Aimé Césaire, has called the boomerang effect of colonialism. In order to make colonialism possible, Europe had to develop political, military, and cultural mechanisms that would then ultimately come back, so be directed against itself. Hitler and Mussolini were only the logical effect of the techniques that were already at work in the colonies. So like ecological collapse, I think, or that's my suggestion for our discussion, that we have to understand fascism not as an event of the future, but as uneven and combined. Fascism follows distinct trajectories with their own pace, and they also mutually influence, stabilize, and destabilize each other. So to come to an end, I want to just point out three implications of this concept. What follows from this idea of uneven and combined fascism politically? So the first thing that I want to suggest is focus on the continuities instead of the ruptures. So when we talk about fascism, oftentimes as many democratic parties and many liberal commentators warn us that the democracy would be eroded because of an electoral success of a fascist party. And they see the danger of fascism as a question of system change, right? We move from one system to another, from a democratic into an authoritarian system. And the political implication of this kind of chronology, of this kind of sequence thinking, is oftentimes, or most of the time, that we have to defend the status quo against fascism, or we have to restore the status quo ante how it was before Millet, how it was before Trump, how it was before the AfD in Germany. So there is a certain notion of normality of liberal capitalist societies that need to be restored against fascism. But if you look at the reality from the perspective of disenfranchised and oftentimes racialized populations, we can see that, as Walter Benjamin says, the state of exception has already been the rule for many. So understanding the ongoingness, the continuity of fascism helps us then not to pathologize Trump or Millet as just a perverse irregularity, and then praise the sanity of the normal status quo of Biden or Harris. But it disillusions us by raising awareness of the many violent and also fascist aspects of the normality of liberal democracy itself. The second implication that I want to suggest is mourn instead of fear. Warning about the apocalypse in the future works with this affect of fear. We're supposed to be afraid about what will happen. Do something, otherwise you will be extinguished. But this fear, I think, again, also binds us effectively to the order, to the fantasy of normality or the fantasy of order. We defend, then we tend to defend something of which we already know that it doesn't work. Understanding that fascism has already happened and is already happening causes a different form of affect. One not of fear, what might happen, but one of mourning. Mourning can take different forms. It can come in the form of remembering or testimony or storytelling. But I think it allows us to engage differently with trauma and the trauma of an ongoing catastrophe. Instead of paralyzing us in front of this gargantuan task, accepting that the world is already in ruins might paradoxically provide us with a new form of agency or hope. And this is really something that I now believe in retrospect that I observed in my Iranian friends at that one dinner in Amsterdam. The reason why they were less anxious or less panicky than I was that they already had lost so much, and that allowed them to develop a new form of hope. It does sound very paradoxical, but I do think it's true. And the last point is salvage instead of restore. If fascism has a differential presence, then the defense against fascism cannot consist in restoring a liberal democratic normality. Rather, as critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, but also the Black radical tradition, have urged us to ground the anti-fascist project in a project of social transformation, a radical reinvention of society. And I think the idea of salvaging, as proposed by Evan Calder-Williams, can help us imagine what this could look like. We do not want to go back. We do not want to restore what has been lost. We do not want to go back to liberal democracy, but we want to roam its ruins and search its remains to see if there is still something that we can use in order to survive in a toxic world. Thank you.
Gracias, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel.
To thank Gisela for organizing this conference, getting us together, and for all the pain she went through in doing this. Also, the translators making it possible for us to be able to be in communication with you. Charlie, the assistants, the technical people who are invisible, but they are what enables us to be here and to be able to meet you. So I really wanted to emphasize that. And of course, the ICCTP, the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs at Berkeley, and the Volkswagen Foundation that enabled this research project. So as the last speaker, I will not read. I will throw some points for discussion because I know it's getting late, and I do really hope that we will have time for some interaction here. So what I'm going to do is to present you with certain problems that I perceive in today's societies and connect to some of the ideas that have been presented here, but maybe dispute them as well, because we need to really bring out on the table all of our also puzzles, because we cannot pretend that we understand what we are going through today. And that is what I want to begin with. Common sense usually can express political and philosophical problems in very striking ways, as Gramsci would have said. And one of the questions that we've been asking each other, if I'm not mistaken, you are also asking this question, is what is this world that we are living in? What is this madness? It comes up in all of our conversations, yeah? So we are trying to name a phenomenon that escapes the classical or traditional, conventional cognitive tools conceptual tools that we used to rely on in order to make sense of our own experience. And today, I think that is a problem that we must accept. We should not do away with this problem. And that's what I think, what Paula called stupidity, sort of consists in thinking that we can name it easily, what we are going through, to put it back into one of the categories that we are so used to using, right? I think we must be humble and admit that we all are confused. And therefore, I would like to begin with a sort of metaphor. This talk will be metaphorical so that we can then build upon these metaphors, perhaps compare with your experience. My experience as a Turkish scholar has been very different, but I know that we have in common the very frequent coups d'etats that our establishment sort of presented to us as our fate in our history, relatively modern histories. We have had 3 coups d'etats in Turkey, the last one being in 1980, but several small coups, even an e-coup, a virtual coup, a failed coup, so all sorts of coups d'etats. And why I think today what we are living through presents more ruptures than continuities. My colleagues have a different idea on this, but I think there are more ruptures than continuities, is that the generation in Turkey that has experienced the 1980 military coup, which was the bloodiest, say, today it's worse. People who were imprisoned during the military coup, whose families were disappeared, whose friends were disappeared, where everything was banned, the military were literally on the streets, say today it is worse. Why? Because even a military coup has structure. You can predict, you can understand, or at least guess how the military are thinking. The military have a rationale. It's realpolitik, right? They want to oppress you, and you find ways to avoid that oppression or go underground and wait till the military government falls, etc. What is making today more difficult to deal with in terms of course, democratic forces, right? Is that we have stopped being able to read the next move of the government or the establishment or the economic powers. I mean, who would have imagined that somebody with a electrical chainsaw would become Argentinian president? Who would have imagined that a crazy person who had a multi-millionaire in the US could become, do some clown tricks in the Oval Office with the US president? Or in Turkey, could we have imagined that, yes, let's say the day before, the Istanbul mayor's university diploma can be annulled, completely revoked. And the Istanbul mayor is a 60 million city, Istanbul, so 1/5 of the rich Turkish economic products are being produced in Istanbul. So they can revoke his diploma one day. The next day, they can imprison him, send police forces to imprison him at 5 o'clock in the morning on terrorism and corruption charges, along with 100 others from the municipality brain team that he had, that they would narrow down the broadband for internet connection so that for 2 days Twitter was down, the stock market was down, YouTube was down, and they would inject millions of dollars into the Turkish economy so that the Turkish lira doesn't plunge, because they have, you know, understood that these moves will somehow bring panic into the stock market. So I think one of the things that we need to think about today is how there is a regime of temporality which consists of accelerated moves by the would-be or fascistic powers that leaves us breathless, us meaning again opposition, and also incapable of guessing what the next move of the power is. We need to understand this change in the regime of temporality, which cannot be conceptualized or grasped without going back, of course, to how capitalism basically is based on the speed of turnover. And since the 1980 neoliberal turn, that speed has accelerated enormously. So we should not forget that there is a material, structural condition of possibility for the so-called populist. I'm with Paula. I do not agree that these leaders should be called populists, but these would-be fascists can, in a way, act with such speed that they immobilize the opposition without even having to execute a coup d'etat. That's the problem. Huh? So legality is not suspended, because in a military coup, legality is suspended. Or in fascism, legality basically becomes the movement's own direction itself. Whatever Hitler says is legality, right? Or is the law, let's say. And fascism, compared to fascism, these would-be fascistic powers that overwhelm us in so many new ways, using all the new dispositives, technological dispositives, of course, I mean, internet, communication technologies, also artificial intelligence, the algorithms. I'm not going into these. There are lots of studies done on how technology actually does contribute to the closing of the universe of discourse and egalitarian struggles, how technology and algorithms turn us into stupid beings, incapable of thinking, Hannah Arendt would say, like little Eichmanns, right? But I'm not going into that technological aspect, although it's important. Technology alone cannot explain what we are going through. I think the neoliberal turn is very important. We mustn't forget that the neoliberal turn has been continuing, and if there's a continuity there, since the late 70s, early 80s. Just remember Margaret Thatcher's infamous slogan, "There is no alternative." Tina, people my age remember that. That was not the declaration of a fact. That was the declaration of a program to do everything possible short of a military coup, without a military coup, to make all alternatives impossible. Yeah? And it was a major societal transformation, not just the transformation of the regime of capital accumulation, but a major societal transformation in which our futures were held hostage by now financialized and very flexible, very, how do you call, invisibilized forms of exploitation and extraction of our material and immaterial labor for the uses of mega profits, right? So this is the backdrop, but I think speed would help us think how there are new techniques of blocking alternatives and immobilizing alternative imaginaries as well as alternative praxis, right? It's not just our praxis that are immobilized, but our capacity to imagine a different future. And therefore, I want to ask if we are today being cornered or trapped into a present without being able to go back to be inspired by a past, because our memories are being constantly erased and the past is being constantly brought into the present as a disconnected story. There is no meaningful story of the past being written anymore. And because our past concepts are no longer much of use to us today, we no longer look back on the past, so the past has been shortened. And the future has been shortened because of the economic technical dispositives I was talking about. We are all indebted, yeah? We need to work today in order, and continue working because the future payment of our credits depend on what we are doing today. So today's are held hostage. But also politically, because neoliberalism could not deliver the promise of development and growth and consumerism for all, these new fascists are going beyond immorality, not just trespassing law, trespassing morality, conventional morality, trespassing all limits, but also performing their capacity to shock and awe us. I think that is very important, which then also becomes a stumbling block in the in our possibility of moving forward. So, like I said, I don't want to continue too much. I want us to discuss. Could we then think of today's fascistic powers as something like this? This is the metaphor I want to propose. So I like Daniel and so many, I think all of our colleagues here don't think the liberal rule of law in any way was immune from fascism. Rule of law, liberalism is not the opposite of fascism. It always had a fascist undercurrent that was applied to workers, the precariat, the ethnicized and racialized and genderized communities. So it always could coexist with fascism. But there's a difference, I think. The difference is it was like a chess game in which every piece had the capacity to move, but its movements were predetermined. So the little pieces could go one at a time. The king could move in every direction, or was it the queen? Okay. Now you know I don't play chess. But anyway, you got it. So, and there was limits because the board was the limit of the game. The game had rules. Now, if we remove the board, remove the norms, the rules, the law, and we, there are certain powerful pieces that can actually set traps for others. So the path that you used to walk on or from become suddenly traps in which you get caught up. You go to, you think law will protect you, and law comes back as a threat against you. Law is being used to criminalize you. That's what's happening in Turkey. There is a facade of legality, but legality has collapsed, basically. Only the facade exists, and it's been used to criminalize. So predictability in such a game is severely reduced, right? But is it only reduced for the opposition or democratic forces? Now, there's the dialectics that I want to bring up, not as a promise of fake hope, because I cannot. I mean, in Turkey, we are at the edge of going over into a full fascist regime. So I don't want to talk about fake hopes, but there is, in this fully contingent situation, there is a chance that fascistic powers may not be able to control all of the demons that they have unleashed by bringing down the institutions, bringing down the laws, bringing down rules of morality, all limits. And that happened when, just after the imprisonment of the Istanbul mayor, the youth that we thought totally apolitical, we thought it was lost to, was it Instagram or something, pushed the police barrier and rushed to the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality building in such a way that all of the opposition parties had to follow the youth. And there emerged a momentum that terrified Erdogan. Okay, so what I want to say, today's forces may not become fully fascistic as in the 1930s. We shouldn't expect checklists. Oh, they need to have brown shirts in order to be fascist. No. But the question is, perhaps because they cannot totalize their power and completely eliminate contingency and manage risk, they open up the possibility for us, if we can reuse our agency and unite, possibility for us to recreate an alternative path for the future. I want to stop there. Thank you.
Bueno.
Thank you very much. We have about half an hour, 25 minutes. So any comments, questions, ideas, reflections will be more than welcome. Yes, Zeynep is telling me that maybe you can share your own experiences and bewilderments. I can't think of the word in Spanish. After speaking English all day, I can't think of my words in Spanish. They need to use the microphone for translation, please.
Thank you very much for all those very interesting contributions. I came from Italy. I'm a philosopher at university in Italy, and we are, I would say, quite expert in fascism. And also at the moment, I think we are in a situation that is opening new perspectives. And in many of your interventions, I found very interesting things that I'm experiencing in my country with this soft fascism that we are making the experience now. But I would like to ask something about the first and the last, a connection between the first and the last paper you read, and because I'm very fascinated by the thing about stupidity. During an interview that Hannah Arendt was giving to Joachim Fest, after all the huge polemics against the concept of banality of evil, somebody, was insisting and asking all the time, what is banality? Because, was very much problem for the Jewish community, the concept of banality, because it was taken as a form of banalization that wasn't at all for Arendt, but, that was a big issue. So during this interview, at one point, Joachim Fest said, would you please come back on the concept of banality and explain us? And Hannah Arendt gave to Joachim Fest an example. And she said that during a trial against Capot in some of the camps, one of those that wasn't high level, it was really Capot, very, very low level. It was the judge was asking why you were so cruel against the Soviet soldiers, and because and these couple answered because they were like animals. And he said, why? I mean, there was a lot of people in camps. Why Soviets or Russian people, they were like animals? And this guy answered and said, because every time they came into the camp, they will just go immediately on the food for the pigs. And Hannah Arendt was very shocked by this answer because she used this as a model of stupidity. Because she said that was anger, wasn't that they were animals. They were just like dying to have something to eat. And this guy was completely stuck in his mind and not able to understand that was something that they need. And this, for Hannah Arendt, was the example of stupidity. Stupidity is the impossibility to put oneself in the skin of somebody else and not to understand what he's feeling in that situation. So this is very connected with what you were saying, you both were saying, because actually at the moment I agree completely with you. The thing that is more problematic for us, even for the people that does this job and thinks about this kind of situation, is the quantity of stupidity we are experiencing, not only in people that trust what these kind of governors are saying, but even in them, because their arguments, their discussions are completely, I don't know, very, very rational, very rational. So this is a point that I think connected very well all the kind of authoritarianism we are experiencing all over the world, in Europe, in Turkey, in South America, and all over. And I will close with this point that is very interesting to me. Gunther Anders, that was, the very real apocalyptic thinker in respect of what you were saying, he talks about the need to develop moral fantasy. Moral fantasy for Gunther Anders was the answer to the lack of insight we have in front of stupidity, and the stupidity of fascism, as you were calling it. Thank you very much.
¿Alguien más?
¿Qué tal? Buenas noches.
Good evening. I'm very, very grateful for all of the interventions. I wanted also to share a comment that maybe connects all of the interventions from the first to the last. I was wondering at which point the way in which we try to promote an agenda of emancipation, at what point aren't we failing to identify that new technologies are a problem because they prevent a discussion or an actual debate, and whether behind this identification there isn't an idea that an agenda for emancipation is an idea that could be articulated rationally, whereas the agenda of the right is an obscure agenda that escapes deliberation, that escapes reason, that escapes discussion. So I don't know to what extent our form of policy is related to the way in which politics were thought after the French Revolution against the ancient regime, the light against darkness, emancipation connected to illustration, against this perspective of the right that is more of obscurantism. So is this still adequate to think about this, and whether we're doing this? Because I'm not sure that that's what we're doing, but that's what I'm asking. Is the problem of our time the fact that the new technologies hinder reasoning, and that speaks in favor of the right? Should we admit that as a reality, as a line of thinking? And to what extent does that hinder us from thinking about two things? On the one hand, a whole series of strategies and levels that are not necessarily related to rationale, to discourse, and that could be strategies of the left, on the one hand. And on the other hand, intellectuality of the right, non-reactionary intellectuality. So what do we do with a more or less sophisticated discussion that is being articulated, like Peter Thiel, like Curtis Darwin, that kind of illustrated right? So I wanted to think about to what measure do we identify with a progressive agenda, and those who identify with a progressive agenda, to what extent do we feel that the illustrated rationale discussion is on our side and we're fighting against the lack of discussion or against irrationality or against these emotions? And if this is the case, or if this is not the case, what do we do with this, with the possibility of maybe having a repertoire that is non-persuasive in the left, and that as a reason for what we are seeing? And what do we do with the persuasive repertoires of the right? Anyone else? Any other comments? In Spanish or English? Thank you, everyone, for the presentations. I have a question about something that came up in several of the interventions, and maybe someone wants to revisit, and it's the issue of temporality. Temporality was mentioned several times in your interventions with more or less precision. And at a certain moment, there was a link between the fascist temporality with acceleration in particular. So I was wondering whether acceleration is a characteristic of fascism, or as we have thought of fascism, the temporalism of fascism is sort of like going backwards and does not involve a continuity. Yes, is it more accelerated, or is it about thinking more of a regressive temporality when we think about fascism? And at the same time, observations about accelerationism that have existed since the beginning of the 20th century in contexts that were not necessarily fascist. So I was wondering whether, if there is such a thing as fascist temporality, and if it is fruitful to think about this or think of these issues within this perspective.
Try not to be too long, like that we can have it around.
¿Yo? A los otros dos, ustedes no. Bueno,
Okay, so regarding what Luciano was mentioning, he's a colleague. I wouldn't put myself in a position where we are in the position of, reason, or that we have the capacity to reason, and on the other side, there's no capacity for reasoning. I wouldn't put myself in that dichotomy. I think that we shouldn't rule out critical thinking, because it does make for the functioning of democratic practices, and supposedly the parliament is there for that, to do critical and rational debate and to vote for the best laws. However, things do not work that way. But what is the way out of that? Well, we spoke about the radical commitment to God, and Butler said, let's commit to desire. Let's develop our own passions in order to stop fascist passions. And I think it's a little bit about that. It's not enough to have critical thinking and reason. We have to be creative. We have to think of new things. We cannot think of politics today deprived of affection. Now, concretely, what to do today, I do not know, but I am at least, in a situation of confusion, and I think we are all in that sort of daze. But what to do in the face of stupidity, I do not know. It's very difficult. When critical and rational debate ceases to function. It no longer functions. Empirical evidence is there, but they do not move. What do we do when we deny a genocide, when we deny the crimes of the military dictatorship? What do you do if you have a flat earther in Congress that denies science and technology? What do you do in the face of these things? I don't know. Sorry, I don't know.
What about fantasy and everything? I think. Just these are going to be quick, but they are very, very profound questions. So one needs to reflect more. But just what comes to our mind. I like the starting from your example of Hannah Arendt's interview. I think for Hannah Arendt, it is not a matter of stupidity in the sense of just lack of intelligence, and I think we know that it is an induced type of stupidity. But is that I think what she's trying to say is, don't be too sure that you wouldn't have done the same. That's exactly what she's saying. Don't be cocksure that you are on the right side and you will stay on the right side. And I think we should all be very aware of that fact, that the fascism or the desires that it creates, and including capitalism, the new, haven of, or even order or command to consume and continue consuming no matter what, like faced with apocalypse, continue business as usual. I think these are not really cognitive matters. So I think we are full within the obscurantism that you were talking about, because these solicit bodily affects and investments from us all the time. And when I say we, I meant we in this room, not they. We are also being interpolated by this, aren't we? I mean, we have credit cards. We also look on the social media. We start, and these are very effective psychic forms of, I wouldn't say conditioning, because conditioning would make us too passive, but reorganizing our subjectivities, and sometimes with our own labor, to adapt to the times and to respond to all this interpolations and desires that we're being bombarded with, right? I think there's a sense in which we too are caught up in some of that. But like Bernhard Stiegler writes a lot on what you are saying, the way technologies induce a form of non-thinking, or reduce our capacities to think otherwise, let's say. And I think these are important forms of research and reflections. But I wouldn't reduce what is happening to us to technology, because don't forget, we're also organizing through them. I think the young people know better than us how to use them as a form of resistance. But one thing I really do want to respond a bit to your question, which is important. I don't think fascism is a regression, is regressive. I know that is how fascism is sort of described, but we can only describe fascism as a regression if we believe that there has been progress. I think the rhetoric is "Make America Great Again," for instance, right? Again, the again there, it makes it seem as if there was a glorious past. But we know what the past of the United States was.
Mexico.
Mexico, right? I mean, And so I think the temporality, the acceleration I was trying to point to is not just about the acceleration of communications, etc., which of course could be very beneficial for a reorganization of a resistance if it manages to sort of imagine an alternative future. But the acceleration traps us into the present. So fascist temporality, I think, is the trapping of potential forms of movement and alternative possibilities in such a way that even if you wanted to or could think independently, resistance would be practically impossible because they would be too quick. Do you see? So we're trapped, and that would be sort of one of the ways in which even if we thought, we couldn't move. So that's what I think makes the fascist temporality. But also fascist temporality, I would say, is mastery over contingency. So fascists even succeed in eliminating any alternative oppositional forces that will stand in their paths and block their own direction. And that means the capacity to eliminate contingency or to control it, right? And so I think there is not just a spatial techniques used there, but also temporal techniques. But I don't want to continue too much.
¿Hay algún comentario?
Any comments? I would like to say just two brief things to highlight two things at the panel. One that is striking to me, the question of what is the source of the damage, so to speak? What's harmed and the source of harm? I think that Luciana's question aims to that. The harmed aspect is the intellectual capacity, and also the diagnostic has to do with the strategy as well, because if getting organized is important. And it's true that the trend is hyper-rationalism. I don't think that affectivity is the abandonment of autonomy, because autonomy does not have to do with the brain, but affectivity. But I was surprised by the different emphasis you placed on the source of origin. Paula said, under certain conditions, these types of ideology gets generated rather than stupidity, because stupidity has a moral load, but ideology does not. Rosaura said neoliberalism brings that about. Daniel Decía, it is capitalism within the capitalist society and the liberal democracy. These types of phenomena occur. And Zeynep, I think, was also, on the one hand, talking about the genealogy of capitalism, and in short terms, the neoliberal turn that she places a lot of emphasis on. Because there is, I'm saying this because there's a language that I think is part of the question, to be able to name things. I think that fascism is great, the word fascism, but the advantage is that it does not make us where we are placing the emphasis. What are we focusing on? We are not discussing if it's capitalism, if it's neoliberalism. If it's enough to say it's neoliberalism, we should not go back in time. Is it enough to say it's a social problem? But when did it start? What are those certain circumstances? So there is a historical social problem. It's not natural. So which is the critical genealogy we have to develop? I think that there is a political advantage in the sense that it allows us not to kill one another before we have put something in common. And there is a question also of the different components of that possible association become marginalized because they feel that their ideology are not named. Only when we mention neoliberalism, they said, but I have been not living well much before that neoliberalism, patriarchy, colonialism, all that brings exclusion. When we do not name capitalism and others, including capitalism as a source of evil, is also a source of fear, and is also going to be excluding. So political discussion is that implies that the names we are bewildered by, but these names also put political strategies at stake and decisions we are going to win by and lose also. And another question in terms of names also, regarding names, the question of the apocalypses, what Daniel mentioned, which I loved, the question of Trotskyism applied to fascism, of course, is the idea that of the unequal and combined fascism, which I think is uneven, and combined fascism, so as not to lose sight of the global aspect, or rather the aspect that colonialism is one of the genealogies, and capitalism, colonial capitalism, is one of the genealogies. It's part of capitalism, is part of the imperialism. I was wondering to which point to wage on the apocalypse, post-apocalyptic sensitivity does not get us trapped into a closed future, something that is to come or that has already passed. Perhaps not everything is an apocalypse in this world. If we believe this has already gone by, we are throwing out the window ambiguities of this world where not everything is an apocalypse. I would not put so much on the apocalyptic sensitivities because it collaborates with the fascist sensitivities. It is a post-apocalyptic compared to the those who think that evil is about to come. To those we have to answer, look, it's already here. The evil is already here. Now to bet on that question is depriving of the class struggle that is at stake now. Not everything is apocalypse. They have already won, if we think in those terms.
Oh, that was a question.
It was an invitation.
The floor is yours.
I mean, I think what is important is to focus on this moment of salvaging. Yeah. So this idea of there is still something to take from the ruins. There is still something that we can work with, and this is what creates a new futurity. This is what creates a new hope, and so on. So it's not just everything. It's a fait accompli. It's a done deal. Like we just mourn. It is also an active, constructive movement, and I think this is a good metaphor, just like for how to relate to the disasters. And I mean, think about the feeling of every horror film or horror novel or something. Right? So you have this constant suspense. Something very terrible might happen any moment, and I think this is this is like a paralyzing feeling where you cannot do anything. But as soon as it has happened, you are kind of redeemed, even though what has happened is terrible. But you have a different. It liberates your feelings, and I think then you're an agent again. And I think this is also true for fascism. It's like if you just wait for it all the time, then it creates a feeling of paralyzation. But if you acknowledge the ongoingness of it, it creates a different kind of affect. And I mean, Eva von Redeker, our collaborator, points this out in her book, where she says, every day now, I don't know how many, 200 species are lost. Yeah, the loss of a complete species is not an extraordinary event anymore. It is our normality. It is like loss is the primary mode of existence in our times. So how do you relate to that? There's a fascist response to loss that aims at restoring a nostalgic past, a completeness, a fullness, a pleasure that is fueled by this fantasy of returning. Or you can mourn it. You can try to salvage. You can try to organize in the face of loss, not to prolong it, but to find something new. And I think this, for me, is an interesting metaphor. I mean, it's not more than a metaphor. In order to also effectively. I mean, I also think it's not just about persuasion. It's about offering a different kind of affective response to this experience, to this objective experience of loss.
Very well, thank you very much.